We are back, boys. We have finished the 4 mutations of consciousness, and now we are moving on. So this chapter, I guess, is called Mutations as an Integral Phenomenon, an intermediate summary. Now, I've got 5 points written down on my book here. I've stolen these points directly from John David Ebert in his series, so credit to John. Go check his out. Point 1. These are 5 points you want to keep in mind for this section. Point 1. Dimensionality and consciousness are symbiotic. Every new structure incorporates a new dimension. Point 2. Some structures are outer-oriented, some are inner-oriented. I like to view it as the difference between extroverts and introverts. So extroverts as the psyche is oriented towards the external, the outside, out there. Whereas introverts, their psyches are oriented internally, in here. That's sort of the difference, and that'll become more clear once we get through it. But if you notice with the magic and the mental structure, those are externally oriented. The focus is the world. Of course, in magic, it's nature, and the mental, it's the spatialized world. And then the mythical and the integral are internal. The mythical is soul, and the integral is kind of soul, spirit, and everything, but it is more internal. It's bringing spirituality, soul, stuff like that back in. Point 3. The integral is inner-oriented and wants to fix the deficient mental structure and render the other structures transparent. Point 4. As new structures emerge, the distance to the ground of origin is correspondingly greater, eschewing the progress model. Big point. Point 5. Each structure has an efficient and deficient phase. So those are the 5 points to just kind of keep in the back of your mind. If you get to a point that's confused, go back then and think, oh, this is what we're talking about. So in this in this section, I believe we get our first cross section. Now, cross section is just this little table here. And on this, it's the space and time relationship, and we'll be getting into it. But that's the beauty of this book. Like all the other great books, you got the charts at the end of it, and there's a lot of good stuff. But this is the space and time relationship chart. Do I want to get into it? Yeah, we might as well. So we'll go through on, let me see if you guys can sort of see that there. Maybe not the best, but on the very left we have structure. So it's archaic, magic, mythical, mental, integral, and then dimensioning. Of course, archaic is 0-dimensional. Magic is 1-dimensional. Mythical is 2-dimensional. Mental is 3, integral is 4. Now, of course, we covered all this in the preceding videos, so go watch those if you're confused. Perspectivity, archaic, none. Magic, pre-perspectival. Mythical, unperspectival. Mental, perspectival. Integral, a-perspectival. Emphasis. Archaic is pre-spatial, pre-temporal. Magic is spaceless, timeless. Mythical is spaceless, natural temporicity. Remember the 2D flat circle, midday, midnight, summer, winter. There's no spring, there's no fall, because that would be 4 poles and not 2. You need 2 poles. Let's see. Mental, spatial and abstractly temporal. Spatial and abstractly temporal. And integral is space-free, time-free. So that's the first cross-section, as he calls it. And I'm sure if you want, you can just go on Google and you could just look up what's the Jean Gebser charts, and you'll find them. So let's get right into it. He says, each and every one of us is not just the sum or quote-unquote result of the mutations described, but their embodiment as a whole that also contains latently the possible further mutation to a-perspectivity. 2 considerations are fundamental to this provisional summary, one with respect to its manner of presentation, the other to its main organizing principle. We must bear in mind that the cross-section in its entirety, which is to organize the material we have discussed so far, will necessarily consist of various thematically ordered sections. Our task, then, is to summarize the various mutually interdependent characteristics of the individual structures and their respective unfolding throughout the course of the mutational sequence. This will provide the main point of departure for our summation. We shall have to inquire into the unfolding of the individual characteristics, forms of manifestation, and interrelationships of the respective structures. So, in the preceding videos, we very rationally, and you can tell because we divided each one from each other, but we have the magic, of course, the mythical, mental, integral, yada yada. These are divided from each other, and in doing so, we were able to confer greater clarity or knowledge of the individual structures. Now, in this section, of course, being properly integral, the structures do not negate one another, and the structures interplay and interconnect with one another. So it's not as simple as this static, the mental is happening right now, static, the magical is happening right now. No, the magic might have predominance, but the mental, the mythical, and the integral are still there. So imagine a bunch of ice skating. Imagine I'm watching some ice skating, or maybe hockey, we'll say, and all the players are skating around, and I pause it. And I say, that's Wayne Gretzky, that's Sidney Crosby, that's Alex Ovechkin, this is quite the game we have. And that's some other Canadian dude who's really good. And I say, okay, and then I just stop there. That's kind of what we did with the preceding videos, which is fine as long as we, and then I hit play. And then they interconnect, you see, everyone starts moving again. There's all these different and particular connections and unique interactions between them. They're not just these static figures that exist separate from each other. No, there's an interplay there. And that's what we're doing with the consciousness structures. All the consciousness structures are working or active at all times, and they're always interplaying with each other. So you might have a predominant mental structure, sure, like most people, or a mythical, like the artists, right? They have feeling, the psyche, and the soul, all that stuff. Yeah, of course, they're capable of rational thought. They might not do it very often, but they are. And they're capable of sort of magic thought, if you want to even consider it that. But that's what we're doing here. We've divided it into static structures statically, and now we're pushing them back in together. Now they're in a flux and dynamic. Okay. Basic to this mode of consideration is the circumstance that we can ascribe to the individual structures certain characteristics within their given relationships to space and time. We have found two categories that serve to express these relationships, dimensions and perspective. When we summarize our previous discussions of the individual structures in the form of a cross-section, the following structuration becomes evident for each of the categories mentioned. When read from the top down, it indicates an unfolding structuration. When read across, a complementary structuration. We are now able to see how every mutation of consciousness that constituted a new structure of consciousness was accompanied by the appearance and effectuality of a new dimension. This clearly underscores the interdependence of consciousness and a space-time world. For each unfolding of consciousness, there is a corresponding unfolding of dimensions. An increase in the one corresponds to an increase of the other. The emergence of consciousness and the dimensioning imply and govern each other. Now remember, this is the beginning of the cross-section here. Archaic is zero-dimensional. We have one-dimensional with the dot. Now I think mathematicians have quibbled with Gebser, so maybe don't take that too literally, but for our purposes, one-dimensional with the dot, two-dimensional with the 2D flat circle with the mythical, and then of course three-dimensional perspectivity. The discovery of perspectivity defined as the ability to render three-dimensional objects on 2D flat surfaces. And then the fourth is four-dimensional, of course. But notice what's happening here. With each new structure that has emerged, we have acquired with it a new dimension that we can deploy or use to bring objects in the world into relation with each other. Very important now. You might think, well, if that's the case, let's speed up this process and let's get 8, 9, 10, 11D. We'll get there. What we have defined as perspectivity is accordingly only one, although essential, aspect of the respective space and time relation, an aspect which only stands out when viewed from the present-day prospectively rigidified world. This shows that consciousness unfolding and dimensioning are accompanied by an increasing reification or materialization of the world. The more dimensions we have, now that we've accrued new dimensions to bring objects in the world into relation with each other, newer or different aspects of the world are becoming more real. So, of course, in magic, nature became more real due to the magical conscious structure. In myth, the internal was reified, meaning made real. It was treated as real. Like, of course, magic nowadays, we don't really treat it as real, but they did. And then the mental, of course, spatial objects, perspectivity, science was the scientific world was reified, the spatialized world was reified, and now in integral, the consciousness structures are being reified, and it's sort of a combination between external, internal, and maybe even spiritual. Very important. These two facts beget further new facts, suggesting thereby the kind of symmetry which, in a remarkable way, underscores the complex problem we can define as the problem of measure and mass. This in turn will illuminate a fourth actuality, namely the symmetry evident in the succession of the mutations, a regularity that is revealing with respect to the mutations in their entirety. as well as to the relationships of the individual structures in themselves, and can accordingly shed light on our present day situation. He said this should indicate that our intention is not to systematize, but rather elucidate the living and working interrelationships and to convey vividly the vital and effective facts that result from these interrelationships. So systematizing, that sounds like mental consciousness structure to me. We are achieving integral consciousness, so we're not systematizing anything. We're just simply illuminating, or as he says, elucidating what is already there. There's nothing for us to systematize. We're just looking at what's naturally happening. All right. Let's see. Before directing our attention to the cross-sections of further unfolding characteristics of the structures, whose next grouping includes their respective sign, essence, and properties, we must consider for a moment the ascriptions made above for the integral structure that result from the particular relation to time and space. Its four-dimensionality represents ultimately an integration of dimensions. It results in a space and time-free a-perspectival world where the free or freed consciousness has at its disposal all latent as well as actual forms of space and time, without having to deny them or to be fully subject to them. So the integral consciousness structure has the knowledge of the relationship to time that the previous structures had, and in doing so, we are not subject to them, but we can deploy them if necessary. So in that sense, we are time-free because we're recognizing time. Depends on what we're talking about. Time to who? Time to magic man, time to mythical man, or time to mental man? Either one, we can talk about it. So in that sense, we are time-free. We've sort of transcended it because it's almost become a concept that we've understood. To what extent this space-time freedom can be realized in life, to what extent it is compatible with the occurrence of presentiation, I hate that he writes that word, and to what degree it can be related to what we call the diaphanon, these are questions which are resolved to the degree that we become aware of further elements that make up the individual structures. So, essentially, with more knowledge of the structures, more profound realizations will be made. Let's see. Now we're going to turn our attention to further cross sections, of course. Now, I apologize. I know you guys can't really see this. But again, just look this stuff up on Google. Just look up Jean Gebser chart or Jean Gebser chart. So the structure, so we have the sign, archaic nun, magic point, mythical circle, mental is triangle, the integral is the sphere. I covered all this. Essence, the archaic is just pure identity. World, rock, food, that's it. Everything is world. Magic is unity. Mythical is polarity. Mental is duality. Integral is diaphanarity. Transparency is what that means, rendering things transparent. Again, we covered all of this, so please, if you're confused, go watch the others. Properties. Archaic is integral. Magic is non-directional unitary, interwovenness, or fusion. Remember, everything is connected in a non-rational nexus. Mythical is circular and polar complementarity. Mental is directed dual oppositionality. And integral is presentiating, diaphanous, rendering whole. There you go. As in the case of dimensioning, it is again evident from the sequence of signs that we can observe an increase or expansion in the course of the mutational series. So, of course, we're increasing and expanding. Also, it reminds me of the Thomas Sowell quote. I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said, look, he's a famous economist, and economics is about what? The allocation of scarce resources. So Thomas Sowell is saying, look, all the scarce resources were available to, we'll say for our terms, primitive man, prehistoric man. They just did not have the knowledge, as he described it, to do what we do with these scarce resources and create all this great stuff. It is knowledge that's part of it, but it's really a complexification of consciousness. So back then, if you go back 30, 40, 50, 60, 70,000 years, millions of years, they simply hadn't undergone these mutational consciousness structures that would allow them to do that. They had not accrued the dimensions of space and time that would allow capitalism or any economics or anything like that to manifest or be created. Interesting stuff. Our choice of signs is not arbitrary, but rather an organic outgrowth of our exposition of the individual structures. The signs do not distort or denature the objectively given state of affairs any more or less than in any instance in which we describe or represent something. So if I call something a volcano, I could call it a volcano, I can call it a volcano, I can call it Justin if I want, I can call it Hillary Clinton if I want. That doesn't change the fact that the object that I'm describing, the symbolized to the symbol of volcano, it doesn't change the reality of it just because I create a symbol and assign that symbol to signify what is being symbolized in this consideration, obviously in this case volcano. So when people try to say, oh, it's a point, it's a circle, it's a triangle, it's too simplistic. No, it's really not. It's not at all. It's no more reductive than any symbol. And I think he's about to say this. Every description or representation contains an alien factor not present in what is described, inasmuch as we are compelled to impose an order on something undeniably organic that confronts our linguistic and conceptual means, and to arrange sequentially an obviously complex event. So it works just like any other symbol does. It is an alien factor that we are imposing onto the object or what is being signified or symbolized. Volcano, VOLCANO, has nothing to do with the objects of volcanoes. Nonetheless, as he said, um, we're arranging sequentially, we're assigning order or conferring order on naturally organic and complex events. And in doing so, we can actually live a life that's worth living, so we can have knowledge of things. So don't let people try to tell you he's being reductive. He's not. The signs convey the extension of the point to a circle, the breakup of the circle by the triangle, that is, the division of the circle into sectors, the quantitative increase and extent of the mutations. Conversely, we can see in the rearrangements that determine the given essence of the structures a counter movement. The increase of dimension by which consciousness gains extent and scope is inversely proportional to the qualitative character of the individual structures, which undergo in each instance a reduction or diminution of value or intensity. The incrementation of consciousness does not correspond to an increase within the relationship to the whole, even if that were possible, but rather to a lessening or weakening of this relationship. We will repeat for emphasis. The incrementation of consciousness does not correspond to an increase within the relationship to the whole, but rather to a lessening or weakening of this relationship. So again, actually, we'll just keep reading. In qualitative terms, then, the expanding consciousness reduces its own system of interrelationships. Unity is only a reduced wholeness, yet an inceptual consciousness in man is possible only once this unity has been achieved. Polarity further expands the arena in which consciousness operates, providing the tension necessary for everything that lives and unfolds. At the same time, the originary presence of the whole is lessened or dimmed. We'll continue, but as we accrue new structures and correspondingly accrue new dimensions, let's say it's the Renaissance, and the mental consciousness structure has mutated and it's in its prime, it's in its youth, it has vitality and energy. The problem is you've now diminished the potency of the magic and mythical, and not only have you done that, you have rearranged the consciousness structures, so now it is not as simple as archaic, magic, mythical, mental, and everything's just going to be fine. No, the psyche has to rework and recreate connections and interrelationships that confer or are conducive to holistic success. Think of it like a basketball or soccer team. I have a soccer team. I've got the 11 best players in the world, and then I've got a really good bench. And naturally, we win a lot of trophies. So you might think, okay, well, we have the transfer window every year. I've got Messi on the right. I've got Ronaldo on the left. Why don't I just buy, I don't know, Robert Lewandowski, who's a really good striker, even though we already have a really good striker, and we'll just bring him in. We'll bring in another world-class player in each position, and if we have to spend the money, so be it. You might think that makes sense, right? If you have Ronaldo on the left and you've got some other guy who's absolutely amazing as his understudy or substitute, logically, that makes sense. It increases your chances on a pure talent level of winning. The problem is you have introduced new egos, new psyches, new people into a dynamic relationship. And now when you add new people, the team has to rearrange itself to get to know you and to integrate and incorporate you into the team culture and ways and values and methods. So it's not as simple. That's why you see like basketball. This might have been a better example. Basketball has a lot of stars. You don't want to have too many stars on a team because now you've got ego. And once you have ego, no longer are we playing for the team. We're playing for stats. We're playing for individuals. And once we start doing that, we might as well just pack it in because we're not going to win. So once we accrue more structures and once we accrue more dimensions with those structures, you might think, well, this is great because now we can be like these. We can just know everything and we can have all these things and life will keep improving. Yes and no. The previous structures that were dominant, they now have to adapt to this new structure, and same with the new structure to them. and they have to work together and find a way to coexist together. And that's going to be a problem because that's going to take time, and it's just like Gebser says, anytime this happens, there is like a sort of dark age, almost literally in this sense. When you had the pre-perspectival world of the ancient Greeks, the first incipient, incipient mutations of the mental structure, it was sort of rejected for like 1,000 years. The Dark Ages came in, and then with the Renaissance, it came back in. But we had to go through that 1,000-year period of extreme irrationality. So the unperspectival world was like, no, we're dominant. I don't want you here. And the rational or the perspectival world was like, well, I want to be here. There's conflict here. It's not as simple as just let's just go 8, 9, 10, 11 dimensions. No, that would be terrible because now it would just be too much. Let's see. Can no longer be at the same time, the originary presence of the whole is lessened or dimmed. It can no longer be experienced to its original degree as wholeness, but only through an act of completion or complementarity. And as noted earlier, the further dimensional increment that drives polar self-complementarity into the dualistic division and measurability of oppositions does not even allow for an act of completion, but at most for an act of unification, which is always fragmentary. So we have wholeness with the archaic, that's ideal. Then we have unity, which is a lessened or diminished form of wholeness. Then we have polarity and complementarity, which is, again, a lessened and diminished form of wholeness. And then we have the mental. And this is, like he says, there isn't really an act of completion there unless you just kind of rationally reconcile things. So, yes, we are getting new dimensions, but that breeds problems. It precludes our ability to re-attain that original wholeness because things are becoming more complex and now things have to be adapted. So there you go. There seems, therefore, to be a qualitative reduction of wholeness that corresponds to the quantitative augmentation of consciousness, which, by dimensioning, creates its own system of interrelationships. The increase in expansion, extension, or growth of consciousness evident in the mutations is inversely proportional to the reduction of the integral system of interrelationships, which it has apparently lost. When viewed in this way, the dimension world seems to be one split off from the whole. The quantitative spatio-temporal system of relationships increases to the degree of the growth of consciousness and is recognizable in the increase of dimensions and reification. Woo! Yet there is at the same time a proportional decrease of the pre-spatial and pre-temporal present of origin. Man is no longer in the whole. Henceforth, he is to an even greater degree merely a participant in the whole, although the whole ultimately cannot be lost since the archaic structure or origin is irrevocably present. So wholeness can never be lost. The ever-present origin, right? It's never going to go anywhere. But think of it like it's like I don't know. It's almost like a cave, and or all these rocks are piling upon it, and there's all this stuff. It's still there. It's still technically there, but it's been obscured. You just have to dig out all these rocks. It's like a boulder scale, or a mountain. Jesus Christ, I can't even. The point is, it's obscured, right? You're gonna have to pick the rocks out, and then there's a little child in there. There was an accident. What takes place here is perhaps less a weakening or a distanciation from origin than a remarkable kind of rearrangement. There you go. To us, accustomed as we are to thinking in terms of subject and object, so as to be capable of mental thinking, this presents itself as a rearrangement of intensity similar to consciousness, in which what is rearranged is carried over from the objective world or universe, i.e., world in its entirety, into man. Excuse me, let me try that again. In which what is rearranged is carried over from the objective world, or universe, i.e., world in its entirety, into man. Man becomes the bearer or agent of the originary consciousness, or whatever we may wish to call it, and his earthly conditionality, via his spatializing and temporalizing, renders terrestrial that which is integral and related to the whole. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. Now let's see. Okay, so now we're going to get into another cross section, which is potentiality and the emphasis. If we are to summarize in a third grouping those aspects which can bring us a step forward toward resolving the questions that have arisen, this cross-section will have to make evident what we have designated as the potentialities of the structure. structures. To the extent that these are potentialities which consciousness opens up through its mutations, we must be aware of the particular aspects of world with which the respective potentialities of consciousness associate. That is, which aspect takes on the nature of consciousness for a given structure. So it's important when you have psychological or internal stuff. You don't need to deploy a mental or even a magical accounting for that. You need to deploy a mythical accounting for that because that's where it derived from. Think the yin and the yang. Symbolism derived from the mythical conscious structure, which of course was birthed from the discovery of the soul in here. So we can do rational analysis of symbols and interpretations. It's just incredibly shallow. It's incredibly shallow. It fundamentally misses what is happening here. So a true symbol always expresses a polar complement. So it's important when you're engaging with symbolism and myth and imagery and narrative and deploy symbolic thought, deploy the mythical consciousness structure, so you're not just missing the point entirely. Let's see. In addition, we must also become aware of the energy, the movement, and dynamism, which is the agent or initiator in man of the particular consciousness emergence. If we do this, we can in mental terms note the particular accentuations of consciousness in the familiar categories of subject and object, which result in the following cross-section. Okay, so we have potentiality. In archaic structure, we have integrality. In the magic, we have unity. In mythical, we have Wait, did we do this? Okay. We have unity by unification and hearing and hearkening in the magic. Mythical, we have unification by complementarity and correspondence. Mental, we have unification by synthesis and reconciliation. And integral, we have integrality by integration and presentation. Emphasis. So this is important. So the A section in this cross-section is objective external aspect of world, and the B is the subjective internal energy or initiator. So in archaic, we have unconscious spirit as the external objective aspect of world, and then the internal none or latency. There just wasn't anything internally going on. Magic, our magic is our objective external is nature, of course. And then the subjective internal would be emotion. Emotion is what an instinct drove Magic Man that was going on internally that awakened the consciousness. In mythical, our objective external is soul psyche, and our subjective is imagination. And mental, our objective external is space world, and our subjective internal is abstraction. So that's what we do when we close our eyes and go into the world of logic. And integral, objective external is conscious spirit, and subjective is concretion. I don't have too much to say on that because I haven't gotten that far in the book, quite frankly. From this, it will be evident that the incrementation of consciousness goes hand in hand with a diminution of the relation to the realizable whole. We do not lose this relation to the whole completely, only because the presence of origin cannot be lost, and consequently, it lends to all of the structures which mutate from it and constitutes us the same imperishability. The next cross-section, by contrast, shows how an increase occurs in the sequence of the aspects of world realizing consciousness, which is accompanied by a simultaneous increase in the powers of emergent consciousness, by which consciousness is increasingly able to become a reality. So, of course, with new structures, new aspects of the world are able to be reified, and we have new dimensions. And when new structures mutate, they have all the power. They're young and vibrant, and they're ready to go. Whereas the old ones, they're getting old, and the new structures usually outpower the old structures. Whereas the tenor of the magic structure is definitely one of nature realized in emotion, and that of the mythical structure is one of the psyche realized in imagery. That's what we just talked about in the cross sections. The tenor of the mental structure is one of a spatialized world realized in thought. So remember, external for magic is nature, and then emotion, that's how it was realized. With mythical, it's the soul or the psyche that's become reified, and we discover it through imagination. And then mental, it's a spatialized world, and we use abstraction. Now it is true that the powers which make possible these realizations increase in number and become conscious and usable. But there is a simultaneous narrowing of the realized aspect of world, which at first glance appears incongruous. Nature and the psyche, both incommensurate, are more all-encompassing than the spatial world apprehended by the measuring thought, which culminates in perspectivity. Now, this is interesting. Is another reason to not be overly concerned with accruing more dimensionalities, but focus instead on the intensity, the moderation and immoderation of the structures and those dimensions, because nature, right, is more all-encompassing than the spatialized scientific world, because in the spatialized scientific world, we're being rational, and rational is inherently limited. And then the psyche, of course, is more all-encompassing than that too. Some people get lost in solipsism or whatever. So it's weird. So from magic, we have nature, which is very sort of holistic. And then we have the psyche, which is holistic, but maybe not quite as holistic as nature, because nature would include you. And then with the spatialized world in science, we have a fundamentally limited world here, because we've reduced things to what is quantifiably measurable and consciously known. But nature encompasses all of it, encompasses that, and was quantifiably immeasurable and consciously known and all that stuff. Let's see. Here we encounter the symmetry spoken of earlier that may provide some assurance where the apparent inconsistencies of the phenomena could tend to become confusing. The symmetry will be apparent from the following cross-section. Okay, so we have consciousness now. So we have the A section is degree. So archaic is deep sleep, magic is sleep, mythical is dream, mental is wakefulness, and integral is transparency. And relation, so archaic deep sleep and universe-related breathing spell. Magic sleep, outer related nature, exhaling, remember the introverted, extroverted, mythical dream, that's the degree, and then inner related psyche, the soul, myth was birth, so magic was extroverted, myth was introverted, mental, I bet you can guess where this is going, outer related, the spatial world, right, and then integral is back in here. It says inward related, inhaling or breathing spell. So he says breathing spell because that was where archaic was. It's trying to get back to the archaic. Let's see. The symmetry to which we have just referred is evident in what we might call the pulse or the breath rhythm inherent in the mutations when considered as a whole. The archaic structure might be thought of as the silent pause before breath, and when we apostrophize this structure in a somewhat unilateral manner as a silent pause, we should also bring to mind the inaudible singing latent in every pause, the musica calata, or silenced music, of which St. John of the Cross once wrote. The magic structure, in turn, inasmuch as it is definitely outer related toward nature, is a first exhalation, one which we do not wish to postulate for the moment as also a form of being exhaled, as this could immediately elicit the undeserved reproach of being animistic. So it's got nothing to do with animism. No, that's not what this is. It's just saying the orientation is directed toward the external world. It's got nothing to do with animism. A likely charge by the dualistic and anthropocentric mentality prevalent today. But the mythical structure, definitely inner, i.e. psyche related, is by comparison to the magic structure definitely suggestive of exhalation. Here we find, so magic is exhalation, myth is inhalation. Here we find the psychic equivalence of the inhaling of the heaven, to which we referred earlier, and this inhalation, as it were, in the mythical structure is even more evident if we consider the mental structure which quote-unquote follows, for it is again decidedly hour related to the world and thus shows a distinctly exhaling character. So you're noticing this natural organic movement. First we have external with the magic, exhaling. Now it's myth, of course, it's inhaling because we're in the internal psyche world, and now we're back to the spatialized world, and now we're back to the integral. There's a natural movement, and when he talks about the conceptual pair of measure and mass, which I actually got a little confused about, but we will pick up on later, he explains how that conceptual pair encompasses mental, mythical, and magical ways of understanding it. So don't get confused, we'll get into it. These conclusions, based on the inner and outer relationships of the various structures, parallel the data presented in the preceding chapter. The opening up and mastery and consequent consciousness emergence of nature by magic man, of the psyche by mythical, and of the objectified world of space by mental man. In this way, the mutational series closes to form a living whole in the symmetry recognizable in the alternation of breath, the organic succession of inhalation and exhalation, as well as in the pulse of the structures. Important. When he says symmetry, this is what he means. Symmetry recognizable in the alternation of breath, the organic succession of inhalation and exhalation, as well as the pulse of the structures. We're not talking a Wes Anderson movie here, where everything is perfectly symmetrical. That's not what this is. Rather, it's almost like I don't want to get too lost in the mythical. It's a natural, organic process of one, then the other. There is no negation here. One, then the other. It's symmetrical because we have inhalation and exhalation, and they kind of feed off each other. It is not symmetrical in the sense of Wes Anderson movies, where everything down the line is the same on both sides. That is not what this is. We have, to all appearances, lent this symmetry to an organic character, giving the mutational process a one-sided biologistic aspect, which, to the extent that the biological is predominantly natural, necessarily takes on a magical taint. But we can also understand this symmetry as a polar event, thereby emphasizing its complementary rather than unitary moment. In so doing, however, we run the danger of mythologizing, and will have to strive to understand the regularity in terms of our still dominant state of consciousness, comprehending mentally in a sequence what would be diaphanously apprehended as a whole. Since the state of diaphanous consciousness and its form of realization have only been initiated and not yet achieved, we will of necessity have to agree on the mental basis. So we have to understand these in mental terms because that's the most prominent structure that we're using right now. It would be good to understand this in mythical, but again, you don't want to catch yourself in being only mythological, because now we're taking on the same deficient aspects that rationalism has done. You don't want that. We can fathom this symmetry in mental or rational terms and extricate it from the biological natural magic as well as the psychic polar mythical spheres by viewing inhalation and exhalation not as a unitary process or as a complementary process, but by understanding it as an antithesis. Yet even this is not sufficient in itself. We must be able to measure the antithesis or antipodes. Only what is measurable can be posited as an opposite, or for that matter posited at all. And, as will be evident, we have taken the first step toward a mental positing and measuring at the very first mention of symmetry. In order to comply adequately with the demand of conceptual measurability as required by the mental structure, we can examine this symmetry in question in terms of the conceptual pair of measure and mass. So he says, we have selected this pair of terms in the first place despite its apparent antithesis, because it is still able to demonstrate its rarely fathomed character as a primal word in the root common to both words. And although everything subsumed by such a conceptual pair bears the stamp of mental antitheticality, it does so only to the extent that it is articulated. In inarticulate form, such a pair also embraces polar, unitary, and originary elements. So conceptual pair of measure and mass. Now, I will give a little critique of Gebser here. He does not offer the greatest explanation of this conceptual pair of measure and mass. So make fun of me all you want, but I went to ChatGPT. Now, here's what it says. The direct connection between measure and mass and the inhalation and the exhalation that we've discussed in this video. The organic dynamic of inhalation and exhalation, understood as the interplay between inner soul psyche and outer worldly orientations, mirrors the relationship between measure and mass. When our inner orientation is active, inhalation, we engage with the world in a way that honors qualitative depth, proportionality, and soulful insight. This is the ideal of measure. It is a dynamic, organic process that gives life its internal order. Excessive exhalation, external mass. When our orientation is overly directed outward, exhalation, the external, quantifiable aspects of reality dominate. This leads to an emphasis on mass, where the richness of inner experience is sidelined in favor of external accumulation, standardization, and reductionism. In essence, Gebser's critique points to a loss of balance. So the conceptual pair of measure and mass is measure is a qualitative aspect, and mass, of course, is the quantifiable aspect. Now, that's going to be important because not in the next video, but the video after that, we're going to be talking about. It's a really great section, a provisional statement of account, measure, and mass. So we'll be getting into it. But he explains that measure and mass, it encompasses, like I said, the magical, the mythical, and the mental way of viewing things. So he's going to be taking a qualitative and quantitative approach to an account of the world at the time that he wrote this. We have selected this pair in the second place because it allows us to observe other revealing phenomena. We could recall in this connection the increase of consciousness and dimensioning, the reification of the world, as well as the apparent contrary movement of the incrementation of consciousness viewed against the diminishing relationship to the whole. Here we have arrived at a particular juncture. All the questions and problems that have surfaced in the previous cross-section come together and are united in the common denominator of the conceptual pair of measure and mass. This result provides a natural conclusion to the present discussion and forms a link between our previous deliberations and the inferences that remain to be drawn from them. We shall accordingly interrupt the moment our summation of individual characteristics begun above in order to establish a provisional statement of account. And that is where we will leave it. Next video, we will be doing a digression on the unity of primal words, and that's exciting. That will fundamentally change the way that you use language. I apologize. Someone's knocking at my door, so hopefully I don't get killed. Thank you guys so much. I hope this was informative, and I'll see you guys next week.